Well, hello there. You must be here to see an Attack on Titan video. Unfortunately, something has happened, which is that the last chapter of the manga came out, and it was quite bad. I didn't like it. I have huge problems with it. I wrote and recorded and edited most of this video between this last episode of the 4th season and the final chapter, expecting the series to follow through on a particular thematic trajectory. Ridiculous. What was I thinking? So now I have a problem. I can either scrap the entire video and make it again, or I can just go ahead and show you the video and then bring you back here to the floor and we can have a chat about it. So in the interest of laziness, that's what I'm going to do. If you're anime only, I still stand by this video 100%. You can just come back and watch this when the series ends and be disappointed then. Okay, goodbye. Okay, so here's how dumb I am. I legitimately thought that this last episode was gonna be the last episode of Attack on Titan. Like, quite literally up until Friday night, I was like marveling at how they were possibly gonna wrap everything up with one episode left and the manga unfinished. It never occurred to me that they just might, like, not. That's fine though, it's fine. It means we have another several months to argue over whether it's fascist or not. A couple years ago, I made a video called Is Attack on Titan Fascist? You can watch it if you want, it's okay. And every now and then that video will get brought up in Twitter conversations as a rebuttal to people saying Attack on Titan is white supremacist propaganda. And every time I see it, I'm like, because that video isn't a very good argument. Sorry. For the uninitiated, the long story short is that Hajime Isayama has been charged by the Twitter mob of being a fascist sympathizer and spreading his noxious worldview through his hit manga series. And I know the story's still not over, but I feel like now that we're at the final arc of the final act of Attack on Titan, we now have enough information to finally address those accusations conclusively, okay? So that's what we're gonna do today. I will be your judge, jury, and defense. I call the court to order. It's my dog's Kylo Ren toy. It's the only item I own that's even sort of gavel-shaped. Opening arguments from the Twitter hive mind. Speak your piece. Just so everyone knows, Isayama modeled one of his main characters on a Japanese war criminal who he explicitly said he admires. He sure did! A few years ago, Hajime Isayama said that this character, Dot Pixis, is based on a Japanese general called Akiyama Yoshifuru who is widely understood to be a war criminal. That's very troubling. Also though, I think it's important to keep in mind that the extent to which Isayama himself supports a nationalist imperialist cause is extremely unclear. I also think it's important to know that Isayama didn't say, I think Akiyama is awesome because of all those Koreans he murdered. He said he admired him for being frugal and respectable, which is both very benign and the most Japanese thing I've heard all day. I am personally okay with consuming the work of someone I may have serious disagreements with, as long as I am reading it critically. There's definitely a line I draw, but Isayama doesn't get there for me. It seems to me like thinking of this war criminal from a perspective informed by the Japanese public school system, which, from what I can find, appears to officially not recognize Akiyama as a war criminal, might lead you to misinformed conclusions, in the same way that growing up in the Deep South might lead you to think that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. Isayama hasn't doubled down on this as far as I can find. In fact, he's a very famously private person who really doesn't say much of anything at all. So no, I'm not willing to call him a fascist sympathizer just for this. That said, if you don't want to support Isayama because of the politics he has expressed, I completely understand why. I didn't pay to watch Attack on Titan. The only reason I can think of to point out the Pixis thing is to somehow suggest that this is like a mask off moment, right? Like this character is evidence that every other aspect of Attack on Titan is engineered to be secretly fascist. But the thing about propaganda is it doesn't really work if it's secret. I wouldn't know that Pixis was based on a real person unless you told me. It's not something that Isayama advertises, it's not central to the character, and it comes up at no point in the story. So unless you just don't want to engage with someone you don't agree with politically, which again, I completely support, Pointing out the Pixis thing is really only useful if you also think the rest of the show is also imperialist fascist propaganda. So let's talk about that instead. Attack on Titan's philosophy clearly applies Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction, a foundation of Nazi ideology, so... Christ, this again. People watch one wisecrack video and suddenly they're goddamn World War II historians. Carl Schmitt was a Nazi law scholar who spelled out the philosophy of government and expansionism, upon which Hitler ran Germany. Bad look. The issue I have with this argument is that it implies that Carl Schmitt is like kind of a Joseph Mengele figure, like a pseudoscientist whose work is useless at best and a fascist dog whistle at worst. The thing is, Carl Schmitt's philosophy is very frequently cited in academic work because it's a pretty great insight into how group identities of any kind support themselves. So think of citing Carl Schmitt as like kind of using a walkthrough manual to cheat at the fascist game. The friend-enemy distinction is his most well-known philosophy. It's basically the idea that everybody is constantly defining everyone around them as either a friend, an ally to you, or an enemy, a threat you need to kill. Taken to its logical conclusion, this means that a group of people, like any nation, defines its own identity primarily by defining what it is not. The application of this to Nazism is pretty obvious, and it's definitely present in Attack on Titan. It's also present in most of modern politics, and accordingly, every story that includes a war of any kind. Let's take a look at how it manifests in another completely unrelated sleeper hit you might have heard of called The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is a story about a bunch of different races who can be easily identified by their appearance and genetic abilities. Some of these races are ugly and evil, and some are pretty and good. Some are in between. The good races need to find their similarities and band together to defeat the bad race, which if left unchecked, will surely destroy the world. So is The Lord of the Rings fascist? No, of course not. The Lord of the Rings is about wholesome shit like friendship and forehead kisses and the value of a simple life and the circumstances under which values like a simple life might need to be fought for. But the friend-enemy dynamic is there, and we can have discourse about it if you want, you know? Pop culture's constant demonization of the other is a worthy conversation to have. But if we're also going to leave out the friendship and the forehead kisses, then we're really not telling a very complete story, are we? And if we were to have that conversation in an academic setting, you'd probably end up citing Carl Schmitt. So the issue here isn't whether Attack on Titan can be made sense of using Carl Schmitt's philosophy. The issue is whether Attack on Titan is saying that the friend-enemy dynamic is good and productive. Carl Schmitt thought it was. That's the other part of his philosophy. That's why he sucks. This is classic Twitter discourse. Casual reminder that Carl Schmitt was literally a Nazi. Yeah, sugar. I know. Everybody knows. Even if Attack on Titan is trying to be anti-racist, it still reproduces the stereotype of genetic inferiority. The Titans are a clear threat to humanity in a way that victims of genocide aren't. So I see the point here. I made a similar point in another video I made several internet millennia ago. But let's look at how this plays out in practice. Are the Eldians really considered a threat? Are they being interred and discriminated against because they could turn into Titans at any moment? No. Their discrimination is not supposed to be for safety, it's supposed to be for atonement. The sun went away. The way this argument is laid out, you'd think that the Eldians could just be expected to turn into Titans willy-nilly. Oops, I stubbed my toe. Looks like your city's getting crushed. Eldians have the genetic potential to turn into Titans, but unless they're one of the 9, they can't just do it at will. They need to be injected. In fact, the only reason anyone becomes a pure Titan over the course of the show is because of the Marleyans. You know, they're oppressors. The prevailing depiction of the show is that Eldians aren't monsters. 9 Eldians at a time have more power than most people. Does that mean Isayama wants us to think of all Eldians as literal monsters you should be repulsed and terrified by? I have it on good authority that a lot of Attack on Titan fans don't. But even Marley is controlled by the Eldian Tiber family. That makes Eldians the clear baddies and feeds into the elitist shadow government conspiracy the alt-right clings to. Is it though? Is Marley controlled by Eldians, or does Marley allow certain Eldians to conditionally rise to positions of influence so they can advertise their moral superiority? Sun went away again. The Tiber family is a perfect example of how it really isn't the Eldians' Titan ability that's the problem at all. If Eldians are so dangerous, how come the Tibers get to keep the Warhammer Titan? Just now realizing that everything I'm saying sounds completely insane out of context. Willie Tiber is only the most conspicuous example of the internalized bigotry that Marley has been forcing onto mainland Eldians for 100 years. That's one of the engines of the war between Marley and Eldia, right? Mainland Eldians looking at their own ethnicity across the pond and saying they're the problem. The bad Eldians, that's why they hate us. If we're just real good, maybe Marley will just give us our rights back. There's a kind of power that exists structurally in segregated societies regardless of individual examples of marginalized people reaching positions of wealth and influence, especially if those positions are contingent on keeping that power structure afloat. Can you think of anyone else who pulls the same kind of shit? Tell me your favorite public figure of internalized bigotry in the comments. None of this keeps Attack on Titan from being fascist propaganda. It uses clear visual references to Nazi Germany, and in not explicitly denouncing these images as bad, it allows the far right to use the series as an endorsement of Nazi ideology. Okay, this is the big one. This is the premise upon which all previous arguments have rested. I am going to call this an argument from aesthetics. An argument from aesthetics takes the superficial imagery of a story and interprets it in a vacuum. And describing it that way makes it sound like the rebuttal is basically don't judge a book by its cover or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. Because despite what your mama may have told you, appearances do in fact matter quite a fucking lot, my love. Imagery like this is extremely emotionally charged, and it's not at all silly to point out that the aesthetic reference here is very obviously early mid-century Western Europe. In propaganda studies, the psychological effect we're worried about when we point this out is called priming. When you activate particular representations of something in someone's memory, like, say, armbands, internment camps, and German names, and associate them with the heroes of the story, it might affect your moral interpretation of those images in the future. Basically, if we make fascist imagery look fun and good, people might think fascism is fun and good, or at least funner and gooder than they would have otherwise. But the effect of priming is extremely narrow. So narrow that some scholars refuse to refer to it at all for fear that someone might misuse it. Good thing we don't know anyone who might do that. A perfect example of intentional priming in media is political signage. Like, a sign saying nothing but vote Democrat isn't trying to make you think about welfare policy or whatever. It's not there to change your mind. It's there to remind you who you are. It's there as social proof, the assurance that voting for Democrats is a reasonable thing to do because others are doing it. The message starts and ends with Democrats exist and you should vote for them. Given the story's ambivalence, the only way Attack on Titan would work as fascist priming is if this imagery were spread around in, say, a sort of meme format on websites that tend to foster fringe perspectives designed for uncritical shitposting. That's definitely something to be concerned about. But that's not how most people watch a TV show, right? The logical follow-up to Attack on Titan uses fashy imagery for anyone sincerely interested in the shows, you know, why? And that's where this argument falls apart, because an argument from aesthetics is by definition a removal of context, and Attack on Titan has a lot of context. I made a list of all the imagery in question. 1. Ethnically German coding. 2. Armbands and internment camps. 3. Militarism. 4. The nose problem. Let's unpack this. 1. Ethnically German coding. Most of the Eldians are white, and Isayama uses a German naming scheme for them. This has been offered as evidence that the Eldians are obviously Nazi stand-ins. The Marleyans, by contrast, are white, and Isayama uses a German naming scheme for them. They're aesthetically indistinguishable from each other. There's just no argument for the Germans being portrayed as the good ones. Let's move on. 2. Armbands and internment camps. That's a pretty fashy thing to do, and up until this last episode, 100% something that the Marleyans do to the Eldians. So this aspect is really only fascist propaganda if the show justifies that discrimination. Are we really prepared to say that Attack on Titan is asking us to identify with the Marleyans over the island Eldians we've spent 3 seasons getting to know and love? No. Also, as of this last episode, Eren is doing it too, so.
誇らしげに巻きつけておられる白い布はイエガー肌と堅持する勲章じゃな。ならば赤い布は 脊髄液入りのワインを服用したと知らされ、服従を強いられたものか。そして、まんまとワインを飲み何も知らされなかった大半の間抜けは、黒い布が目印とな。マハレとやり方が似ておるのう。お主らの生まれ故郷もこのようにして支配されたのではないか。
3. Militarism. Both societies are extremely heavily militarized. But again, this only works as propaganda if the military on either side is portrayed as absolutely a good thing always. Well, there's simply no defending Attack on Titan here. Look at all these people fulfilling their greatest potential for glory in motherland. Look at how happy they all are to be here. Strong, self-assured, never a doubt in their mind, never a thought to spare for the morals of what they're doing or what's happening to them. Read the goddamn room, people. No one is here because they want to be. They're here because they feel like they have to be. We'll get back to that later. First, we have to talk about the nose problem. Okay, I know as judge and jury, I'm supposed to be hella neutral and unbiased, but I'm just gonna show my hand here. I think this is the most desperate, ridiculous piece of evidence in this entire conversation, and it gives me secondhand embarrassment just to talk about. The argument goes that Hajime Isayama is reproducing Nazi propaganda of the inherent monstrousness of the Jews by making the Titans mindless, gross, destructive horror shows, and he is coding them as Jews by sometimes giving them big noses.
Oh, honey, no.
I don't know Isayama's inner thoughts. I don't know whether he thinks big noses are a visual shorthand for evil. I do know that the Titans often have some kind of grossly exaggerated feature, and I do know that there are only so many features on the human face available to exaggerate. Some Titans don't have very cute noses, okay? Others have exaggerated features that are non-nasal, like this one, and 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 these ones, and those ones, and this one, and this one. I also know that many human characters are drawn with bigger noses than the typical anime character, probably because their designs are based more on a broadly European set of features than East Asian, like this one, and 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 this one. I also know that the Titans are Eldians, who are the obvious heroes of the story throughout the first 3 seasons. So let's say Attack on Titan is supposed to be an allegory for Nazi Germany and World War II. Who's supposed to be who here? Both Marlians and Eldians share visual cues of what we culturally understand as symbols of Jews as oppressed and Germans as oppressor. So how do we categorize them? It's almost like you're not supposed to identify either one of them definitively as Jews or Nazis. It's almost like Isayama deliberately scrambled the identifying features of both of them to maybe make a point about the uselessness of making judgments based on appearances or the actions of previous generations. Even if that's the case, that implies that the Jews somehow had a hand in their own genocide, which is a common and dangerous right-wing talking point that we don't need to be indulging. If you can't tell me who's supposed to be the Jews and who's supposed to be the Germans here, then there's no implication this show on its own can make about either of them. That's not how people's brains interpret narratives. Think of priming this way. When you turn the TV off, what feeling are you left with? Priming affects what you do by affecting your emotions. So, in the first 2 seasons, I would say that the overarching feeling is of fear and defensiveness. Very easy to turn that into fascist propaganda. But now, when I watch Attack on Titan, I just feel kind of tired and sad. Are those fascist emotions? None of this changes the fact that the imagery Attack on Titan is using can be extremely emotionally harmful to victims of persecution and genocide, and nobody should have to confront those feelings just so everybody else can have their little war fantasy. If watching Attack on Titan hurts you or someone you love, and you don't like it for that reason, then I think the best thing for you to do is leave the conversation. I sympathize. That's real pain that should be respected. There's media I avoid because it hurts me too. But we have to give people room to think critically about difficult ideas, and that's all there is to it. And I know it seems silly to hold up a monster anime as something that needs to be protected for the benefit of all, but if you want someone to think hard about a social issue, the absolute best way to do it is to tell them a story about it. It's well documented that human brains aren't hardwired to process lectures or read theory. They're hardwired to process stories. And I worry that the way we've told stories about fascism since World War II really isn't helping people understand it very well. We need to keep talking about events like the Holocaust, but I could honestly go my entire life without seeing another movie about it. The thing is that, except among certain kinds of fringe Holocaust deniers, the Holocaust was bad is not really the lesson that we here in the year 2021 need to take from it. Like, a lot of Holocaust movies are basically just torture porn, right? They're exploitation. They visually reproduce a historical trauma that systematically removes dignity from an entire group of people for money. It's kind of analogous to the only prestige Hollywood portrayal of Black people being slavery or civil rights prior to like last year. And there are certainly worse things the film industry can and does do, but dealing with traumatic histories has to go beyond what we get now, which is basically, boy, that sure was a bad thing that happened, wasn't it? Sure was bad. Look at all the bad things the Nazis did. Want to pay me to see how bad it was? The Holocaust has been reproduced so many times in so many different mediums that I worry that we're now primed to understand it as more of a story on a screen than a thing that actually happened and needs to be prevented from happening again. I worry that turning the systematic murder of millions of people into an emotionally satisfying narrative can obscure something really important, which is that the horror of the Holocaust isn't in how Nazis suck, it's in how people suck. Fascism is an ideology you adopt, not a characteristic you're born with. Nazis aren't special that way. And I'm not saying that maybe we should try turning the tables and making the Jews the villains for once. That should very obviously not be done. What I am saying is that there are ways we need to think about events like the Holocaust that are not well served by direct adaptation, which can be so emotionally charged that thinking past the initial shock of what you're looking at can be impossible. It's like starting a conversation with someone by punching them in the gut. Even an unframed painting is still defined by its borders, the point where the artist decided to stop. There is no neutral ground when we're discussing war and genocide because war is a human issue that all of us have a stake in. And as a person who pays their bills studying this stuff, I am typically more concerned about the war stories that don't make you uncomfortable than the ones that do, because the film industry has spent the last century perfecting how they can convince an audience to give them money. And the prevailing wisdom is that people won't give you very much money if you ask them to watch something that makes them feel confused about their beliefs. War is just so much easier to think about when we have clear good guys and bad guys. And when I see people online accusing Attack on Titan of being fascist, I don't see a bunch of reasonable, intellectually sensitive media critics. I see a bunch of people who think that the righteousness of their goals justifies acting in bad faith up to and including alienating and abusing people. Man, if only there was a story out there that addressed the human tendency to do that. You know, maybe something about like confusing justice with vengeance, charging all members of a group with the sins of a few. Like something about how some actions can be both justified and immoral. Like I bet that story would be pretty timely. Probably get a lot of attention. Also, I'm not going to come right out and say that these accusations against Attack on Titan are racist, because I don't necessarily think they are. I just think it's a little weird that there's this media narrative surrounding this show that really doesn't exist to the same degree for something like The Man in the High Castle or Jojo Rabbit. There's just sort of a flavor in the air here of assuming only Western filmmakers can address an issue like fascism with nuance. Like an anime just can't be trusted to know what it's doing with this subject matter. Something to think about. So in conclusion, class, Attack on Titan is not fascist. Certainly not any more than any other story that features fascism in order to criticize it. I had my doubts for a while, but the verdict is not guilty. And at the end of all this, I just have to ask for my own sake, won't someone please think of the monsters? Could someone please spare a thought for these sad, gross weirdos with no pants and too many teeth and appreciate what a bizarre and unsexy representation of war this is? In Susan Sontag's essay Against Interpretation, she says, "Interpretation, based on the highly dubious theory that a work of art is composed of items of content, violates art. It makes art into an article for use. for arrangement into a mental scheme of categories. For me, the saddest and most annoying thing about this conversation is that it strips away everything new and interesting that might exist in Attack on Titan and tries to retrofit it into something old. It's treating the aesthetics of this show like gift wrapping you can just tear away to find out what the show really means, instead of sitting with the weirdness of these things and asking ourselves why they creep us out so much when they really just look like Steve from IT. That's the thing that got me into this show in the first place. The thing that saves my first video, thank God, and the reason the Titans might be my favorite monster ever on screen. What possible better representation could there be of human violence than these pudgy, pasty people rampaging through lives and consuming everything for no reason at all, like a little kid torturing bugs? How could you possibly glorify violence less? This is it. We found the anti-fascist text. At least until Eren is revealed to be the undisputed hero of the new Eldian Empire and all under its reign. That would happen to me. So that isn't exactly how things end up, but it is close enough to piss me off. What bothers me about the final chapter of the manga is not, per se, what happens. With this series, I've excused a lot of bad writing because thematically everything looked like it was on point. So it doesn't really bother me that Historia isn't really important anymore. The Eren and Mikasa love story doesn't bother me. That's fine. I am even willing to excuse the things about the final chapter that don't make sense, like the Ymir Deus Ex Machina that involves Mikasa for some reason that they won't explain. I'm willing to excuse the time travel bullshit. I am okay with the rumbling as a plot point, but now I really honestly have to wonder whether everything good Isayama did here was just an accident, and he is really, in the end, just not a very good or a very careful writer. Thank you for turning yourself into a mass murderer for our sake. Bad. So there's two different things happening here. The first is this dumb, bad Watchmen 5D chess type strategy to unite everybody against a common enemy, but then also Eren actually really does want to just commit genocide, and the manga's trying to do both of those at once. Either one of those can be okay if they're, if they're drawn out enough, but you can't do both at once. They're mutually exclusive themes. So now we have this 11th hour redemption arc that doesn't make any sense for any of the characters involved. And it's like so nonsensical that I wonder whether something was lost in translation or something. There's no good feeling available to attach to Eren's actions here. It doesn't make sense for Armin to say that. Like, why not just have Eren's friends feel sad about the person he used to be and miss him despite what happened? Why does Eren need to be redeemed? So remember how priming works. You associate good, warm feelings with something that you want the audience to feel good, warm feelings about. Foregrounding the horrors of fascism is not a good way to prime people to support fascism. You know what is a good way? Going out of your way as an author to redeem a character you have firmly established is irredeemable. Literally up until last Friday, the theme of Attack on Titan was war and bigotry sustain themselves and perpetuate themselves through human pain and weakness. And now the theme is people who commit war atrocities probably had a good reason. Those are very different themes, but they're close enough that I think what happened here is that an ending was decided upon a long time ago and retconned into the last chapter after the series had outgrown it. It's kind of the same thing that happened with Game of Thrones. So far the response that I've seen to this online has been that everything was out of character, everything was very rushed, both of which I agree with, and both of which I think are basically just different ways of saying that the ending did not match the rest of the series. Everything in the video you just watched, I completely stand by up until literally the last couple of pages of this manga. And I don't think that's a sign of secret fascism. I think it's a sign of bad writing. Bad, sloppy, irresponsible writing. Some things in a story, like the tone of your ending, should not be a surprise. If you have a party and you serve a cake with frosting that looks like strawberry, but it's actually meat puree, that's not a surprise. That's being a shitty party host. Like a really weird, bad party host. The Titans as monsters are a surprise. When Eren gets eaten, that's a surprise. Chapter 139 is meat cake. When you tell your audience they're getting strawberry, give them strawberry. Otherwise, they're going to feel like a bunch of fools. I feel like the biggest fool. I've been defending this series from the beginning. I do think that we need to tell more complicated war stories, and I think Attack on Titan is a pretty good example of how we might do that. I do think there's some cultural gatekeeping in who's allowed to address certain themes and who isn't. And I do think that that was a factor in the criticism of Attack on Titan. I don't think that Isayama is a propagandist, and I do think that Attack on Titan overall is an explicit criticism of fascism. But who's gonna believe me now? So that's all I have to say, I guess. I'll hold out hope that this show cleans this up and makes it presentable, but otherwise I think I'm done here. You can follow me on Twitter at bookkeeper123. I write theatrical reviews every week for highdefninja.com, and you can subscribe if you want to see me talk about monsters in media and the other things I love, even though all they ever seem to do is disappoint me. And goodbye.